September 4th, 2017. It's Labor Day in Prince George County, Virginia, a quiet rural community just south of Richmond.
It's about family. It's about enjoying the weather and just getting together and enjoying having that day off with family and friends.
Although that afternoon, the truck stop off Highway 460 is bustling with activity.
This is where folks stop in and get gas and get something to eat real quick because people use this as a back road to go to Virginia Beach.
But for the patrons at this roadside stop, their relaxing holiday is about to take a horrific turn.
At approximately 4 p.m., Prince George County 911 received a flurry of frightened calls.
They were flooding the 911 line.
And they were all reporting the same thing.
There was an active shooter call at the Pilot gas station.
Within minutes, multiple units converge on the scene and are directed to the fast food restaurant connected to the gas station.
When the police arrive, you're worried about where the shooter might be located or if the scene is still active.
But the shooter has fled, leaving chaos in their wake.
They see people behind the counter terrified just based on what just taking place.
They had all witnessed the shooting of a young man.
He's laying on the floor. He's bleeding out.
He had been shot multiple times.
According to the student ID that was found in his wallet, his name was Karan Bond.
20-year-old Karan Bond grew up in the tough streets of Richmond, Virginia.
Richmond is one of those places to where it's always fighting for the top spot as the murder capital.
So many murders, so many drugs, so much crime. It's not so good.
It was the hood for the most part. Craziness happened, but still a lot of good people around.
Karan's family was among the best.
Karan came from a close-knit family.
Karan is a mama's boy. He just loved his mom and his dad. And he had a special relationship with each one of his siblings.
Everybody just loved him. He was the baby boy, so you know how that goes.
He was the youngest of 5. And spoiled riding, I couldn't imagine a tighter group.
Raised under the watchful eye of older siblings, Karan stayed out of trouble.
When you grow up poor and you see everybody else getting money, but they getting it the wrong way, and you see where they ending up. We wouldn't allow our little brothers to do that. Like, me and my sister stayed on them. We stayed on our brothers, make sure they get best grades, not get in trouble in school.
Man, y'all boys crazy, man.
Not that it was hard to keep Karan on track.
Karan was absolutely a go-getter.
Karan was focused on the books.
He knew that having an education was going to be something that was going to aid him in whatever way he wanted to go.
Graduated in top of his class.
After high school, Karan moved on to Virginia State University.
Virginia State University, it is one of the United States' first accredited HBCUs.
He really wanted to go to an HBCU and represent as a young black man. He wanted to have that degree.
I was proud of my brother. I was happy for him to start college.
Karan continued to excel at Virginia State.
He was just adamant about making sure that he put his best work forward.
And though only a sophomore, he already had a vision for his future.
His major was business.
He always had an entrepreneur dream. He wasn't going to be somebody who worked for someone else very long.
His catchphrases was, "I just want to be great." And he meant that.
Not that Karan was all work and no play.
He was the life of the party.
He could put a smile on anybody. He can make anybody laugh. Easygoing and fun lover is how I describe him.
And when it came to women, Karan was a hit.
Oh, what's up?
As far as the ladies, Lord, we don't want to talk about that because we'll be here till next year.
He was a natural dancer. If it was any kind of trending dance, he was on it.
He's the cutest thing. He had this big old smile. He was always dressed really nice. And he was smart. He was pretty much everything that any young girl at that age would have wanted, and it showed.
He had a lot of prospects.
But after Karan met a fellow student named Kia March, he became a one-woman man.
Nice. You're in my econ class, right?
Yeah, I'm a business major.
Really? Mm-hmm. Me too.
They both wanted to do big things in life.
My brother loved her. I know he loved her a whole lot.
They were very serious and devoted. He definitely seemed happy.
But now, someone has shot Karan multiple times in the midst of a crowded restaurant.
It's Labor Day. It's a small community, and there's a shooting that happens in the midst of what should be a celebratory holiday.
After the police arrived, secured the scene, and made sure that the shooter wasn't there.
Hey, buddy, can you hear me?
The next step was to get him to the hospital as quickly as possible.
While EMTs race to save Karan, the police try to piece together what happened.
There were plenty of people at the truck stop who witnessed the shooting.
The restaurant side was busy, the gas station side was busy, a lot of people in and out.
He had on a black hoodie.
Several of them told police the same story.
All he did was walk up and pull a gun and say,
I heard you got a problem with my sister.
20-year-old Karan Bond, a sophomore at Virginia State University, had met his match in an ambitious co-ed named Kia March.
They were college sweethearts.
These two had a bright future together.
But now, Karan is being rushed to the nearest trauma center after being gunned down in broad daylight.
The shooting occurred in the middle of a busy truck stop on Labor Day afternoon.
To pull up with a gun in a restaurant full of people on the holidays and shoot somebody, it was crazy.
It was unreal because nothing happens in Prince George County.
When detectives arrive and begin talking to the customers who witnessed the shooting, the scenario they describe sounds like a hit.
Karan was sitting at a table. He was sitting alone on his phone, and his back was towards the counter.
This guy just came in the door on the far side of the restaurant, and I really couldn't even see his face.
The description of the shooter was that he came in with a hoodie that was closely tied around his face.
Witnesses say they were immediately suspicious as the shooter walked into the restaurant.
Who wears a hoodie tied like that?
It seems to me that he was trying his best not to be identified.
According to the witnesses, he went straight for Karan, pulling the gun as he approached.
He just came in and walked over to this other guy and shot him.
After Karan is shot, he gets up and he tries to flee the scene.
But he didn't get far.
The gunman fires another shot and shoots Karan in the back.
Hit a second time, Karan fell to the floor.
Then the person in the black hoodie fled the scene.
He actually fled through the front door where he got into a vehicle and he immediately sped away.
Witnesses are saying, well, he went right up to this guy. You could tell that is a premeditated, it's cold, it's calculated, it's intentional.
Did you hear anything? Did he say anything?
Yeah, he was saying something sort of, I heard you had a problem with my sister.
Heard you got a problem with my sister.
That's a very vital piece of information.
To detectives, it sounds like the shooting stemmed from some sort of personal dispute.
We're gonna go check this out.
At that point, detectives, of course, wanted to figure out who was the sister in question.
Questioning employees of the restaurant raises one possibility.
Apparently the victim's girlfriend works here.
The authorities find out that Karan's girlfriend was actually an employee.
So it wasn't uncommon for him to drop her off at work. It wasn't uncommon for him to hang around a little bit before she started her shift.
Was she working today?
Yeah.
What's her name?
Kia. Kia March.
Kia March.
Could Kia be the sister that the gunman mentioned?
Do you know if they've had any issues up to today?
I don't think so.
He was there actually just dropping her off for her to start her shift.
Where can I find Kia?
I think she's in the back. She's really shook up.
However, before the detectives can talk to Kia, there's a commotion outside the restaurant.
Ma'am, please! That's my baby in there. My daughter had just called me, Mom, Karan been shot. By the time I got there, they would not let me get in.
Drawn by the noise, the detectives pull Karan's mother aside and inform her that Karan has been rushed to the hospital.
Karan was med-flighted to VCU Medical Center, which is in Richmond.
However, that's not the only news that the detectives have for Karan's mother.
Karan didn't make it to the hospital.
He is pronounced dead before he even arrives.
Ma'am, I'm so sorry.
It was an unbelievable moment for me. I was in disbelief.
And she has no idea why anyone would want to hurt her son.
He was such a good student. He was well-liked, never got into trouble.
He was a good boy.
I understand.
He never did anything to anybody. He was not that type of kid to be involved in any nonsense. Never had a history of anything. This kid wouldn't jaywalk. I couldn't understand.
I just couldn't believe that it could have happened to him.
And the one lead the detectives have appears to be a dead end.
Listen, the shooter said Karan had a problem with his sister. Any idea what this is about?
No.
Ma'am, his girlfriend, Kia, do you know she has a brother?
I don't think so.
Was this a case of mistaken identity?
Sure they are missing something, detectives turn to Kia, who was holed up in the restaurant manager's office.
Kia was an absolute wreck.
She is traumatized. She is in a state of shock.
All right, we're gonna have this officer escort you down to the office, and we'll speak with you there once we're done here, okay?
She was unable to give a statement to the police officers because she was so distraught.
It has to be traumatizing to witness someone die like that.
However, a fellow employee who has been trying to comfort Kia does have some information for the detectives.
A couple of our co-workers left right after the shooting.
They were LaShawna Jacobs and Norma Glover.
At this point, nobody knows if they're fleeing because they're scared or if they were a part of the incident.
Detectives investigating the murder of Karan Bond inside a rural Virginia fast food restaurant have learned that 2 restaurant employees fled the scene of the shooting.
They need to find out what they know and what they saw.
The 2 employees that fled the scene may have the missing pieces to actually what happened to Karan.
Given what just occurred, the fact that they ran from the restaurant isn't all that surprising.
In the chaos, you have many people that fled.
But was it fear of the shooter that caused them to flee? Or was it something else?
This particular witness seen an argument between Karan's girlfriend, Kia, and one of them 2 employees that fled the scene about 45 minutes before the shooting occurred.
That employee was Norma Glover.
Was that just a coincidence? Or was there a connection?
You were just arguing and now you're fleeing the scene after the shooting. It seems kind of sketchy.
At the crime scene, detectives have police issue a statement to the media asking for Norma and the co-worker she fled with, LaShawna Jacobs, to come forward.
They say we need to question Norma and LaShawna in regards to information for the shooting death of Karan.
Then the detectives head down to the station to get a formal statement from Karan's girlfriend, Kia.
She had been in the restaurant and witnessed her boyfriend's murder.
Kia was so traumatized that at that moment couldn't talk to her.
Kia is now calm enough to give her statement.
Although when detectives bring up her coworker, Norma Glover, Kia becomes emotional.
It was all my fault.
Nope, don't blame yourself.
You don't understand.
She explains that the argument with Norma actually started about a week ago.
Kia was the shift manager. She was responsible for the employees and the productivity of that shift.
It was the lunch rush. We were already short-handed.
They were having manpower issues.
She relayed to Norma and to everybody else, hey, I need everybody on that game.
But Norma wasn't a team player.
Norma just walked away, clocked out, and left.
That left Kia without a worker.
Everybody plays a key role, and if somebody drops out, that leaves you in a bind.
Orders backed up, lines got long, and customers complained.
The manager comes down on the shift leader, who is Kia, saying, you got to keep a better eye on your people because we can't have this happening.
Kia explained, I didn't let anybody do anything. She left on her own.
As a result, the manager had words with Norma.
She's reprimanded for her actions.
The manager said, hey, if this happened again, I'm gonna have to let you go.
Kia says that the manager's warning had only enraged Norma.
She also said that Norma had started harassing her.
She'd get up in my face and call me names.
She was in fear of losing her job, but she also labeled Kia as a snitch.
What did you say? You heard me?
It can certainly get volatile in the workplace, and it can get ugly pretty fast.
Kia says her feud with Norma wasn't just ugly. It was scary.
Norma was saying to her that she was going to have someone hurt her.
Which was why Kia had turned to Karan.
You think she'll really do something to hurt you?
I don't know. She's crazy.
Karan, being a supportive, nurturing boyfriend, decides that he wants to assist his girlfriend.
It's fine. I'll stay a little bit longer.
You do that?
I got you.
Out of love, he shows up to work with her to offer her that protection.
Kia says that just as she feared, things had gotten heated as soon as Norma showed up for her shift.
She started arguing immediately.
So you better tell the boss that I was on time today. Hey, I was just doing my job.
Kia and Norma are going back and forth.
It was loud, it was confrontational.
What did you say?
They're screaming at each other.
But according to Kia, Norma had backed off once she spotted Karan in the dining area.
And what's he doing here?
Nothing. He's just waiting on a friend.
He was really there to back up Kia to make sure nothing happened.
Kia says that after the altercation with Norma, she'd gone out to the dining area and spoken to Karan.
She'd asked him to stick around a little longer.
Kia seemed to be scared that something was going to happen.
Karan, being Karan, let Kia know he had her back.
Karan was there just kind of to be there for her.
He wanted to protect Kia and make sure that she was okay.
But as it turned out, it was Karan who needed protecting.
Barely 45 minutes later, the gunman walked through the door.
Heard you got a problem with my sister.
Kia is certain that this has everything to do with the feud that she's had with Norma.
And after a little digging, the detectives think so too.
Norma did have a half-brother.
His name is Julius Moultrie III.
Detectives believe 27-year-old Julius Moultrie may be the mysterious gunman who walked into a rural Virginia truck stop and gunned down Karan Bond.
Julius's half-sister Norma had an issue with Karan's girlfriend, Kia March.
Someone heard the gunman say, "I heard you have a problem with my sister."
That isn't the only thing that points to Julius.
He had a rap sheet 9 or 10 pages long.
But it's one charge in particular that catches the detective's eye.
He had been convicted of actually killing Norma's father, his stepfather.
He did like 3 years on a 15-year sentence.
Moultrie had only been released from jail 9 months prior.
And now the detectives suspect he'd killed again.
Julius killed his stepdad, Norma's father, his half-sister's father. If you're willing to kill somebody that close to you, you definitely can potentially do this to somebody else with no ties.
At that point, there was a manhunt. Locate him and bring him in.
Within a few hours, police traced Julius to his girlfriend's house.
They knew he was in the area just because of what tower his cell phone was bouncing off of.
Officers moved quickly and quietly to surround the house.
The police weren't taking any chances.
Julius Moultrie, come out! Come out of the house! Come on out, keep your hands up!
He surrenders to the Prince George County Police Department.
He was cooperative, and he had no problem going in for questioning.
Once he sits down with detectives, Julius denies any role in Karan's murder.
We know you shot Karan Bond.
I wasn't there. Couldn't have been.
He said that he had been at his girlfriend's house all day.
Your girlfriend's, huh? We'll see about that.
When detectives checked with his girlfriend, who they had also brought in for questioning, her story is a bit different.
She actually says that Julius didn't show up to her home until later on that day.
Confronted with the inconsistencies in their stories, Julius changes his.
He then says, "Oh, wait a minute. I was actually at my friend's house in Petersburg."
Did you go anywhere else?
No, sir.
The detectives are all but certain he's lying.
Detectives at this time, they decided to do a gunshot residue test.
It comes back positive. He actually held a gun and he fired it on that day.
The test results are enough for the detectives to place Julius under arrest.
Julius was charged with first-degree murder.
The suspected shooter's arrest is welcome news for Karan's friends and family. But they're shocked to learn he'd recently been released from prison for manslaughter.
He killed someone intentionally and only get 3 years for it.
When we found out, it was a slap in the face. That was extremely frustrated and upset.
But detectives believe the blame for Karan's death doesn't rest solely with Julius.
Basically, Norma and Kia got into it, and she started popping off about how her family and how they was gonna mess her up.
Kia was saying, "Hey, listen, I'm gonna get my boyfriend involved. He's gonna deal with you."
What detectives wanted to know is if Norma actually instructed her brother to kill him, or if he acted on his own volition.
Since Norma and Lashana have yet to come forward voluntarily, detectives once again turn to the media.
They are asking anyone who has information on the whereabouts of Norma and LaShawna to give that information to the Prince George's County Police Department.
The request produces several tips regarding Norma and her friend LaShawna's location.
Both of the women taken into custody.
When questioned by detectives, Norma initially denied knowing anything about Karan's murder.
Then why'd you run, Norma?
Because they were shooting up the place.
No.
Glover says they were afraid of getting shot themselves.
Of course, the detectives know different.
Stop lying, okay?
We already arrested Julius.
She figured out that she was caught.
She admits that her brother was actually the killer.
But according to Norma, the detectives have it all wrong.
Norma said, I didn't tell my brother to come in and kill Karan. I didn't tell my brother to come in and shoot anybody.
Truth is, I tried to stop him.
Norma Glover has confirmed that her brother Julius Moultrie is the man that shot and killed Karan Bond at the fast food restaurant where she worked.
I tried to stop him.
She slipped on him and snitched on him.
Which is kind of ironic considering how angry she had been about Kia supposedly snitching on her.
However, Norma denies asking Julius to kill Karan.
Norma insists that she was not the one who called Julius to the scene. She says that she was actually on the phone with her mother.
Look, I was upset, and I was just telling my mama about what had happened. Julius must have overheard.
Oh, okay. So he just took it upon himself to come up there and shoot Karan, right?
Look, I know how it sounds, but y'all don't know Julius.
She described Julius as crazy.
She explains that he just recently, not too long ago, got out of prison.
When he gets upset, there's no telling what he'll do.
Norma says that as soon as she saw Julius pull up outside the restaurant, she knew there would be trouble.
She did visibly see that he was angry.
She said, I tried to stop him. I tried to stop my brother.
Norma tells detectives that she tried to calm him down, but he brushed right past her.
Norma says she was still outside when she heard the shots.
All right, Norma, just tell us what happened, okay?
LaShawna came running out, and we ran to my car. And next thing I know, he was there.
He who?
Julius.
Norma says Julius forced her and LaShawn in the car and demanded that they leave the scene.
What you do?
Right.
Norma tells authorities that her brother made her and LaShawna drive him to a nearby relative's home.
Just because Norma was cooperating, that didn't mean that she was as innocent as she claimed.
When police question her coworker, LaShawna Jacobs, she also claims to be an innocent bystander.
Look, I wasn't even supposed to be there. I already clocked out.
Her story is that she stuck around simply because Norma was her ride home.
LaShawna, when the incident was occurring, was on the phone with her boyfriend, who is detained at Riverside Regional Jail.
I'm gonna call you back, okay?
She got off the phone with him to actually calm down the feud between Norma and Kia.
Oh, Norma, let it go. No, look, she over there running to her boyfriend like I'm scared of him or something.
Norma was spewing out all of these obscenities and all of these threats.
LaShawna was trying everything that she could to calm Norma down. LaShawna said that she even called Norma's mother in hopes that her mother could calm her down.
You called her mom?
Yeah, because she was talking crazy. Come on.
LaShawna was still trying to calm Norma down, but she didn't make any progress.
Norma was actually telling her mother that she was going to get someone to pistol whip Kia.
LaShawna didn't know if that someone was supposed to be Julius.
However, LaShawna says she did see Norma in the parking lot talking to her brother moments before the murder.
She witnessed Norma and Julius having a conversation, and Norma pointing to Karan saying, that's him right there.
She wasn't trying to stop him.
After this, Julius actually walks into the restaurant and he shoots Karan.
LaShawna says that in the chaos afterwards, she'd found Norma in the parking lot.
She said they were getting in the car when Julius came running up.
He hopped in and they took off.
LaShawna says she was afraid for her life.
Is LaShawna telling the truth? There may be a way for detectives to confirm at least some of her story.
LaShawna was on the phone with her boyfriend, who was incarcerated when the fight was going on.
Jail, the phone calls are recorded.
And when the detectives pull the tape of the call, their contents back up LaShawna's account.
Police were able to hear in the background Norma yelling and screaming,
I know people, okay? I know killers.
Based on the testimony of LaShawna Jacobs, detectives have been able to confirm via a recorded jail line that Norma Glover was threatening to call a shooter to the restaurant the day Karan Bond was killed.
I know killers.
With that new information, she is charged with first-degree murder.
Man, just thank God they were arrested so fast. They were arrested before I even made arrangements with the funeral home.
I'm glad that she was arrested because I couldn't understand why, in between an argument with two women, that you would have someone come in with that intent.
I can't say I was relieved that the officers did their due diligence.
When Julius goes on trial in July of 2018, the courtroom is packed.
Julius is the first to go to trial.
However, there is no jury.
Julius opted at this point to have a bench trial.
In a bench trial, it's the judge who determines the verdict.
With all of the evidence that police had, it didn't seem as though Julius had a chance.
Not that the prospect of a short trial and a quick verdict made facing Karan's killer any easier on the family.
He screamed in my face. He stared us down. He was very disrespectful. He was just terrible.
It was aggravating. I wanted to get my hands on him so bad.
Although according to the prosecutors, it was Julius who'd come down to the restaurant looking for blood on the afternoon of the murder.
He'd heard about the fight between Norma and Kia, and that Kia's boyfriend was there.
Julius got the information, worked himself into a rage, just, over the top.
Everybody has, crazy cousins and crazy family members that you know about.
Julius had a violent past. He had recently gotten out of prison for killing his own stepfather.
He already had that tendency to become violent.
But it was his sister who provided the target for his rage.
She pointed to my brother and said, "That's him right there."
He knew exactly who to walk up to, ask the question.
Heard you got a problem with my sister.
And he just shot him.
Brother was trying to turn and run, and he got shot again.
He was not a fighter. He was not a thug. He was not a gangster. He was a college student.
I could imagine that he was terrified.
My brother just died on the floor.
The prosecutors present plenty of evidence that Julius was Karan's killer.
They had the gunshot residue test that came back positive.
Norma implicated Julius as the person who in fact did this heinous act.
For the judge, it all adds up to a murder conviction.
He found Julius guilty of murder.
The judge sentences Julius to life in prison. And in the state of Virginia, there is no parole for murder convictions.
He'll be spending the rest of his life behind bars.
It's not enough for Karan's family.
He's in prison, but he's still alive. He's still getting 3 hearts in the cot. You know, he's probably moving through, functioning. I mean, he was there not too long prior, so I'm pretty sure he was accustomed to being in prison already.
The family was still upset that Julius was out on parole for manslaughter when the murder occurred.
He should have never been released from the first murder he committed.
If he was still in there, my brother would be alive.
When Norma, who also opts for a bench trial, goes before the judge, the prosecutors know that the case against her isn't as cut and dry.
After all, it was Julius that pulled the trigger.
But the prosecution argues the murder never would have happened if Norma hadn't pointed Karan out to her brother.
She knew who her brother was, and she knew how he was. She knew what the heck was gonna happen.
Just because you don't pull the trigger doesn't mean you didn't have anything to do with it.
If Norma wouldn't have pointed out Karan Bond would be here today.
She should be held just as accountable as her brother was for the whole situation. Even though he was a trigger man, she pretty much hired an assassin or a hitman to come kill my brother, because in essence, that's exactly what she did.
Still, the defense insists Norma can't be blamed for the killing.
Norma's defense attorney said that she had no knowledge that her brother was going to commit that murder. She had no knowledge that he was going to come to that restaurant.
She says that she could not control Julius. She says that he was crazy, that he was irate, and that she could not have stopped him even if she wanted to.
Julius was going to act any way that he wanted to regardless.
But when the judge delivers his verdict, he determines that Julius isn't solely responsible for Karan's death.
The judge finds Norma Glover guilty of first-degree murder and sentences her to 48 years in prison.
I wish she had gotten life.
She was the cause of it. None of this would have happened if it weren't for her.
And the friends and family Karan left behind still struggle to understand why it happened at all.
It's extremely frustrating to know that such a sweet kid was murdered in cold blood by someone he didn't know and didn't have any interaction with. It's just mind-boggling.
The reality of today's world is people get so worked up about very minor things. I mean, you're talking about an argument over a shift. Really? We're gonna kill somebody over that?
His life is cut short for nothing.
But he will always be remembered.
If I could talk to him now, I would tell him how much he was missed and how much of an impact he already had. He always told us he just wanted to be great, but that he was already great.
I love my brother and I miss him. Like, I miss him a whole lot. And as long as I'm alive, he will never be forgotten, that's for sure.
The night of April 19, 1989, did not look like the kind of night that would become history. It looked ordinary in the way only a city like New York can make ordinary feel deceptive. The kind of night where the lights never truly go out, they just change shape. Street lamps stretching into wet asphalt. Taxi headlights slicing through intersections. Apartment windows glowing like scattered thoughts across the skyline. In Central Park, the darkness was never complete. Even at its quietest hours, the park breathed with distant city noise. Sirens softened by distance. The occasional laughter from late walkers who believed the park was still part of the city's safety rather than its shadows. Trees stood dense and unmoving, their branches forming ceilings that swallowed light in uneven patches. Paths curved and disappeared, as if the park itself refused to be fully mapped at night. That evening, a 28-year-old woman entered that space with the simplest intention. She went running. Her name was Trisha Maley. To anyone watching from afar, she would have seemed like a silhouette in motion, a figure moving with rhythm and discipline, blending into the quiet choreography of nighttime exercise. There was nothing dramatic about her presence. No sense of anticipation. No awareness that she was stepping into a moment that would fracture into headlines, investigations, and years of debate. She ran because it was routine. Because the city outside the park was too loud, too sharp, too compressed. Inside Central Park, there was supposed to be air. Space. A kind of controlled isolation where thoughts could settle into pace with footsteps. But that night, something else was already in motion inside the park. Something that did not follow rhythm or routine. Earlier, groups of teenagers had gathered in and around Central Park. Not unusual for spring evenings in New York, where school breaks and city energy often collided in unpredictable ways. Some came to talk, some to roam, some simply to be part of movement that felt bigger than their individual lives. There was noise, laughter, moments of chaos that spread and dissolved through different sections of the park like ripples in water. The park was not silent. It was alive in a different, uneven way. And in that unevenness, order can blur into confusion, and confusion can become something far more dangerous when seen through the wrong eyes. As the night deepened, the distance between activity and interpretation began to shrink. Patrol units moved through certain areas. Reports of disturbances circulated. And in the absence of clarity, assumptions began to form shapes that would later prove impossible to erase. But none of that was visible to Trisha Maley as she ran deeper into the park. At some point during her route, she left the better-lit paths. Whether by choice or by the natural pull of familiarity, she moved into a less illuminated section of the park. The trees grew closer together there, the ground uneven, the light fractured into thin, scattered fragments that never fully reached the earth. Her footsteps were steady. Measured. The kind of rhythm that erases thought, leaving only breath and movement. In those moments, the body becomes its own language, and the world narrows into repetition, step, inhale, step, exhale. Then something broke that rhythm. It did not announce itself. There was no warning, no gradual shift that could be recognized in hindsight as a turning point. Later, investigators would try to reconstruct those seconds, layering assumptions over absence, but the truth of it remains locked in the fragment where movement stopped meaning safety. What is known is this: she was attacked. The violence that followed was not contained. It was not controlled. It spilled across time in a way that made later description feel inadequate, as if language itself struggled to hold the weight of what had happened in that hidden part of the park. She was beaten with brutal force. Left injured beyond immediate comprehension. And subjected to an assault that would later define the case in both its horror and its controversy. At some point, the attacker left her behind. The park did not react. It remained what it had always been, trees absorbing sound, darkness settling back into place as if nothing had changed. The paths nearby continued to exist in their indifferent geometry. The city beyond the park continued its own rhythm, unaware that inside one of its oldest public spaces, a life had been pushed to the edge of disappearance. Hours passed. Night moved toward early morning in the slow, irreversible way it always does. The park began to transition, not into safety, but into visibility. Light shifted through the canopy, revealing shapes that had been hidden. Joggers returned to familiar routes. Maintenance workers prepared for another day of quiet labor. The world resumed its pattern without knowing what lay beneath its surface. It was during this transition that she was found. Her body lay in a remote section of Central Park, partially obscured by vegetation. The scene was not one of immediate clarity. It required attention, proximity, the unwilling act of recognition. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for something less final, something still salvageable. But closer inspection removed that illusion. She was alive. Barely. Her breathing existed in fragments, irregular and fragile, as if the body itself was struggling to maintain its own instruction to continue. Severe trauma had altered everything about her physical condition. Her face bore evidence of repeated impact. Her body was weakened to the point where movement was no longer a possibility, only survival in its most minimal form. The discovery triggered immediate emergency response. Officers arrived. Medical teams followed. The urgency of the scene left little space for interpretation. What mattered was extraction, stabilization, and the attempt to preserve a life that was already suspended between presence and absence. As she was transported out of the park, the city that surrounded Central Park began to change tone. News spreads differently in a place like New York. It does not travel linearly. It explodes outward, moving through radio reports, police scanners, early morning conversations, newsroom calls, and the silent exchange of information between people who have not yet seen anything, but already feel its weight. By sunrise, something had already formed around the incident. Not clarity, but attention. Not understanding, but intensity. A woman had been attacked in Central Park. Severely. Brutally. Found barely alive. The simplicity of those facts carried an emotional charge that began to spread faster than details could keep up. The park, usually associated with leisure, nature, and controlled escape from urban density, was suddenly redefined in public imagination as something else entirely. A place where vulnerability could become invisible. Where safety could dissolve without warning. But in the early hours, there was still very little certainty. Who had done this remained unknown. Why it had happened remained unknown. Even the exact sequence of events was unclear, buried under the limitations of trauma and time. The only certainty was the condition in which she had been found, and the urgency that followed her discovery. And while the city began to process what had happened to her, another process was already beginning in parallel. One that would move through different corridors. Police departments. Patrol reports. Witness statements. Fragments of observation gathered from a night that had already blurred in memory. In Central Park, that same space where she had been found, officers began retracing paths. Looking for disturbances. Looking for anything that might explain how such violence could occur in a public park surrounded by one of the most heavily policed cities in the world. But Central Park at night does not easily give up its secrets. It absorbs them. It reshapes them. It turns certainty into speculation. And as the investigation began, the city did not yet know that this case would not remain contained within a single narrative. It would split into competing truths. Conflicting accounts. Interpretations shaped by pressure, fear, and urgency. At the center of it all lay a woman fighting for her life in a hospital bed, unaware of the storm forming around the violence she had endured. And somewhere within the same city, the first threads of suspicion were already beginning to form. The city woke up the next morning the way it always did, without asking permission from the night before. In New York, mornings do not arrive gently. They replace darkness rather than dissolve it. Subways roar back into motion beneath the streets. Coffee carts reopen their metal shutters with familiar clatter. Office workers step into sidewalks already filled with movement, as if the city had never paused at all. But on April 20, 1989, something felt misaligned beneath that routine rhythm. It was not visible in any single place, not something you could point to directly. It existed instead as a collective tension, an invisible awareness spreading through conversations, radio broadcasts, and the slow unfolding of early news reports. A woman had been attacked in Central Park. The words were simple, but they carried weight that grew heavier with each retelling. Central Park was not supposed to hold that kind of story. It was supposed to be the city's exhale, not its wound. A place of recreation, not rupture. And yet now, every mention of it seemed altered, as if the name itself had changed texture overnight. Inside police precincts, the setting was different from the outside world. Fluorescent lights replaced sunrise. Coffee that had gone cold hours ago sat beside stacks of reports. Phones rang with increasing urgency, each call adding another fragment to a picture that was still incomplete. Detectives moved through early notes, trying to establish a timeline that refused to stabilize. The park was large, complex, and full of intersecting paths where memory could easily blur into uncertainty. Witness accounts did not align cleanly. Some descriptions contradicted others. Others lacked detail entirely, shaped more by emotion than observation. In the absence of clarity, investigators began doing what investigators often do under pressure. They looked for patterns. They looked for groups. They looked for anything that could anchor an event that otherwise drifted in too many directions. Central Park, on the night of April 19th, had also been the site of unrelated disturbances involving groups of teenagers. Reports of noise, movement, disruption in different sections of the park. None of these reports were initially connected to the assault itself in any confirmed way, but in the early stages of an investigation, proximity often becomes a kind of suggestion. And suggestion, when repeated enough times in a system under strain, can begin to resemble direction. By the time the sun fully rose, attention had already begun to shift toward a cluster of young individuals who had been in the park that night. 5 teenagers, moving in different combinations across different areas, were detained in connection with unrelated incidents. Their ages ranged from early to mid-adolescence. They were not known as a coordinated group in any formal sense, but in the chaotic mapping of that night, their paths had crossed in ways that would later be interpreted as significant. Their names would soon become inseparable from the case. But at that moment, they were still just boys in custody rooms that smelled like stale air and overused detergent, sitting under lights that made time feel heavier than it should. Outside those rooms, the investigation was accelerating. There is a particular kind of urgency that develops in high-profile cases involving violence in public spaces. It is not just professional pressure. It is social pressure. Political pressure. The pressure of a city that demands resolution not because resolution is easy, but because uncertainty feels unacceptable. Central Park was now not just a crime scene. It was a symbol under construction. And symbols, once formed, begin to influence the way facts are interpreted. As detectives moved between interviews and reports, the narrative tension around the case began to harden. Early assumptions started to guide questioning. Certain details were emphasized. Others were set aside. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of a narrowing focus that often comes when investigators believe they are moving closer to an answer. Inside interrogation rooms, that focus became even more concentrated. The rooms themselves were unremarkable. Small tables, hard chairs, walls that absorbed sound rather than reflected it. But the atmosphere inside them was never neutral. Time behaved differently there. Minutes stretched. Silence became pressure. Every question repeated with slight variation carried the expectation of eventual collapse. The teenagers who entered those rooms did not enter as equal participants in a structured legal process. They entered as individuals under suspicion, separated from the outside world in ways that made context harder to maintain. Some of them were questioned for hours. Some were moved between rooms. Some were confronted with statements they had not seen before, asked to respond in conditions where clarity was already compromised by exhaustion and fear. What emerged from those sessions were statements that would later become central to the case. But at the time, they were not stable narratives. They were fragments. Shifting accounts. Pieces of speech formed under pressure, later written down, later interpreted, later compared against one another as if they belonged to a single coherent story. In the broader city, however, none of these procedural complexities were visible. What people saw was simpler. A brutal attack in Central Park. A victim fighting for her life. A group of teenagers in custody. And a growing sense that something had gone deeply wrong in a place that was supposed to be safe. Newspapers began shaping the language around the case. Headlines emphasized violence. Words like savage, wild, and uncontrollable began appearing in public discourse. The park itself, once associated with calm, became reimagined through a darker lens. People who had run there for years began reconsidering their routines. Parents warned children more strictly. The geography of fear began to redraw everyday behavior. In hospitals, Tricia Mailey remained in critical condition, her survival still uncertain in those early days. Medical staff worked with precision and urgency, focused entirely on stabilization. Outside her room, updates filtered into the public sphere in controlled fragments. There were no guarantees. Only cautious statements. Only the fragile hope that she might recover. Her identity was not yet fully public in those first hours. She was referred to in ways that protected her anonymity, but anonymity in a case like this does not last long. The story itself demands a face, even when that face is not yet ready to be seen. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to tighten. Evidence collection from the park was ongoing, though challenged by the size of the area and the delay between the incident and full awareness of its severity. Environmental conditions had already begun altering certain traces. Night had passed. Morning traffic had passed through nearby areas. The natural instability of an outdoor scene meant that time itself was a silent participant in the investigation, erasing as much as it preserved. Still, detectives worked through what remained. Physical evidence. Witness fragments. Statements from those who had been in or near the park. Each piece examined not only for what it said, but for how it might connect to the emerging focus of the case. And as those connections were drawn, reinforced, and re-examined, a narrative began to take shape. Not yet finalized, but increasingly structured. A story with actors. A sequence of events. A direction. What was missing, at least in the early stages, was the possibility that the structure itself might be incomplete. That possibility would not enter public understanding for years. For now, the city continued to move forward, unaware that the case forming in its headlines was already becoming more complex than any single explanation could contain. And within that complexity, 5 teenagers waited in rooms where the future was being written around them, one question at a time. The hospital room where Tricia Mailey lay was not the kind of place that allowed stories to form easily. It was too clean, too controlled, too filled with the steady rhythm of machines that reduced human existence into numbers and signals. Beeping monitors marked her heart rate. Tubes carried fluids through carefully calculated routes. Lights above her bed stayed constant, refusing to acknowledge the passage of day or night. Outside that room, New York was already turning her into a narrative. Inside it, there was no narrative at all. Only survival. She was 28 years old, a graduate of a prestigious university, an employee at a major financial institution in Manhattan, someone whose life had been built through structure and discipline. Friends and colleagues described her as focused, intelligent, quietly determined. She was not someone who sought attention, nor someone who lived at the center of chaos. Her world, before that night, had been composed of predictable rhythms: work, running, reading, conversations that ended cleanly. And then, in a single evening, all of that structure collapsed into something unrecognizable. The injuries she sustained were severe enough that even experienced medical staff approached her case with caution. Her condition was critical. Her consciousness was absent. And yet, there remained something that doctors always pay attention to in cases like this: persistence. The body's refusal to fully surrender. In the early days after the attack, there were no clear guarantees. Family members waited in corridors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and exhaustion. Conversations with doctors were careful, filled with medical language that softened uncertainty without eliminating it. No one used definitive statements. Everything was conditional. Everything was possible, but nothing was assured. Outside the hospital, however, certainty was forming elsewhere. Her identity became public. Her name entered news broadcasts, newspaper columns, and radio updates. She was no longer just a victim in a Central Park incident. She became a symbol that people could attach meaning to, even before understanding what had fully happened. The phrase Central Park jogger began to circulate. It was simple, almost neutral on the surface, but it carried emotional weight. It emphasized her activity at the moment of the attack rather than her identity beyond it. It reduced a full life into a single moment of motion interrupted. People repeated the phrase in conversations across the city. In offices, in kitchens, on subways. And with repetition, it began to shape perception. The image formed in the public mind was not of a complete person, but of a runner, alone in a vast park, interrupted by violence that felt both random and deeply unsettling. That sense of randomness was crucial. It created fear that extended beyond the specifics of the case. If someone running in a well-known public space could be attacked so brutally, then safety itself began to feel conditional. Not guaranteed by geography, but dependent on unseen factors that no one could fully control. Central Park, in public imagination, began to shift. A place once associated with leisure, families, and escape from urban density became layered with tension. People began to reinterpret its spaces differently. Paths that had once felt familiar now seemed ambiguous. Areas that had once been considered peaceful were now discussed in terms of risk. The park had not changed physically, but perception had altered its emotional architecture. Meanwhile, within the hospital, the woman at the center of this transformation remained unaware of the narrative growing around her. Her recovery, when it began, was not immediate or dramatic. It was gradual, uncertain, marked by small signs rather than clear breakthroughs. In critical trauma cases, progress often appears in fragments: a slight response, a flicker of awareness, a change in neurological activity that suggests possibility rather than certainty. Medical staff observed carefully. Family members waited for signs that could be interpreted as meaningfully intentional. But for a long time, she remained in a state where consciousness did not fully return. And while her body was being sustained through medical intervention, the outside world was already constructing explanations for what had happened to her. In the early stages of the investigation, attention had begun to concentrate on a group of teenagers who had been in Central Park that same night. Their presence in the park had been recorded through various police interactions related to unrelated disturbances. They were not initially connected to the assault in any confirmed forensic sense, but in the rapid acceleration of the case, proximity became a powerful factor. 5 boys, all teenagers, were taken into custody. Their ages were young enough that the implications were immediately striking. Adolescence carries its own vulnerability, and when placed within the framework of a violent crime investigation, that vulnerability becomes even more visible. These were not adults with established histories in the legal system. They were minors navigating a city that already placed pressure on their movements and identities. Inside interrogation rooms, their experiences diverged, but certain patterns would later become central to legal scrutiny. Long questioning sessions. Repeated interviews. Statements taken under conditions that would later be debated extensively in court and in public discourse. The details of those interrogations would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. At the time, however, those complexities were not visible to the broader public. What people saw was simpler, more direct. A violent crime had occurred. A victim was fighting for her life. A group of teenagers had been detained. And the system was working to connect those elements into a coherent explanation. The pressure to resolve the case was immense. New York in 1989 was a city highly sensitive to crime narratives, particularly those involving public spaces and perceived breakdowns in safety. Political attention intensified. Media coverage expanded. The case became not only a criminal investigation, but also a public event unfolding in real time. Within that environment, the identity of Tricia Mailey became both central and, paradoxically, abstract. To her family and friends, she remained a person. Someone with history, relationships, daily habits, and a life that existed far beyond the moment of violence. But in public discourse, she became increasingly associated with the incident itself. Her individuality was partially absorbed into the structure of the case. That tension between person and symbol is one of the most difficult aspects of high-profile crime cases. The need for narrative clarity often compresses individuality into representation. And once that process begins, it is difficult to reverse. In hospital records, however, she remained exactly what she was: a patient in critical condition, undergoing treatment, monitored continuously, her status updated in careful medical language that resisted dramatic interpretation. Her recovery, when it eventually began to show more consistent signs, would still take time. Months would pass before any meaningful return of awareness could be confirmed. Even then, the path forward would not be simple or linear. Trauma of that magnitude does not resolve in a single direction. It unfolds unevenly, with progress and setbacks coexisting in the same timeline. But in the early phase of the case, none of that future was visible. What existed instead was uncertainty layered with urgency. A city trying to understand an act of violence it could not easily categorize. A hospital working to preserve a life suspended between states. An investigation accelerating under pressure. And a narrative forming in public consciousness that would soon extend far beyond the boundaries of what was actually known. At the center of it all was a woman whose identity, at least for now, was being defined by something she could not yet describe, could not yet remember, and could not yet respond to. And that silence, in its own way, became part of the story. The night of April 19, 1989, began like 1,000 other spring nights in New York, but it did not stay ordinary for long. It accumulated tension in invisible layers, the way humidity builds before a storm that no one yet names. By the time darkness fully settled over New York City, the city had already divided itself into overlapping rhythms: commuters finishing late shifts, teenagers moving in groups through public spaces, and the steady, indifferent circulation of a metropolis that never truly sleeps. Inside Central Park, the atmosphere that night was shaped by contrast. On one side, pockets of calm where joggers, couples, and solitary walkers moved through dimly lit paths under trees just beginning to bloom with spring growth. On the other, scattered groups of teenagers moving unpredictably between different sections of the park, their presence more audible than visible, voices rising and falling in bursts that dissolved into the darkness. Nothing about the park itself suggested inevitability. It was not a place that announced danger. It was a place that hid it, if it appeared at all, behind distance and shadow and the sheer scale of its geography. Paths bent away from one another. Lawns opened into spaces without clear edges. Even sound behaved strangely there, absorbed and scattered by trees that turned noise into fragments. In the hours before the attack, police activity in and around the park increased due to reports of disturbances. Officers responded to complaints of noise, movement, and disorder in several areas. These reports were not unusual for a warm spring night in the city, but the accumulation of them created a sense of attention focused unevenly across different zones of the park. The responses were localized, fragmented, and often reactive rather than coordinated. Within this environment, the distinction between presence and implication became fragile. The victim, Trisha Maley, entered the park with no awareness of the invisible currents moving through it. She was not part of any group activity that night. She was not responding to disturbance or seeking out noise. She was doing something far simpler, something almost invisible in its normalcy. She was running. Running in Central Park was, for many New Yorkers, an act of routine. It was a way to carve out control in a city that rarely offered it freely. The park provided a kind of illusion of separation from urban density, even though it sat directly inside it. For someone like her, disciplined and accustomed to structure, running would have been both physical exercise and mental clarity, a way to organize thought through movement. Witness accounts placed her moving along familiar jogging routes before veering into a less illuminated section of the park. That transition, whether intentional or incidental, marked the point where visibility decreased and environmental complexity increased. Trees grew closer. Light became uneven. The sound of the city beyond the park faded into something less defined. At some point during that route, she was attacked. The details of what occurred in those moments were reconstructed later through forensic evidence and medical interpretation, but the immediate reality of it was not observed directly by witnesses. What is known is that the assault was severe, prolonged, and carried out with a level of violence that shocked investigators when they first encountered the scene. It was not an encounter that left ambiguity about intent. It was an act that transformed space into aftermath. After the attack, the assailant left her in a remote section of the park, partially concealed by vegetation. The absence of immediate discovery extended the critical window before medical intervention. In trauma cases of this magnitude, time becomes an additional factor in survival, and here time had passed without interruption. When she was eventually found, it was not through deliberate search, but through the slow return of routine movement into that section of the park. The discovery was accidental, the kind of accidental encounter that often defines urban tragedy. She was alive, but barely, her condition immediately recognized as life-threatening. Emergency responders transported her quickly, initiating the medical response that would define the next phase of her existence. But in those early hours, before full identification, and before the narrative solidified, the city was still dealing with uncertainty. A woman had been found in critical condition in Central Park. The attacker was unknown. The motive was unknown. The sequence of events was incomplete. In parallel with medical intervention, the investigation began forming its initial structure. Detectives arrived at the scene and began mapping the environment, documenting the physical layout, and identifying areas of potential relevance. The park's size and complexity made this process inherently difficult. Unlike enclosed spaces, outdoor crime scenes do not remain static. Environmental conditions, human movement, and time itself alter the surface of evidence. Early investigation focused on reconstructing movement patterns within the park that night. Officers reviewed reports of disturbances, interviewed individuals who had been present in various areas and attempted to establish a timeline that could align activity with the estimated time of the assault. In the absence of direct witnesses to the attack, investigators relied heavily on circumstantial proximity. This included identifying individuals who had been present in the park during the relevant time frame and who had also come into contact with law enforcement during unrelated incidents that night. It was within this overlapping field of presence that attention began to converge on a group of teenagers. Their presence in the park was documented through multiple police interactions earlier in the evening. These interactions were related to disturbances and were not initially connected to the assault. However, as the investigation progressed and pressure to identify a suspect increased, the relevance of their presence began to be reassessed. 5 teenagers were taken into custody. Each of them was questioned separately. Each interrogation followed its own trajectory, shaped by the conditions of the room, the duration of questioning, and the psychological state of the individuals involved. Over time, statements were produced that would later become central to legal proceedings. At the moment of their creation, however, these statements were not yet fixed narratives. They were fluid, influenced by fatigue, confusion, and the dynamics of interrogation itself. The broader public did not have access to these internal complexities. What they saw was a simpler sequence: a brutal crime in a public park, a victim in critical condition, and a group of detained teenagers. The gap between procedural reality and public perception began to widen almost immediately. Media coverage intensified that gap. Early reports emphasized the severity of the attack and the vulnerability of the victim. The park itself became a focal point of discussion, reimagined through the lens of violence rather than leisure. The phrase, "Central Park Jogger," began to circulate, reducing the identity of the victim into a symbolic reference tied to the act of running and the location of the crime. That linguistic simplification carried unintended consequences. It shaped perception in ways that extended beyond the specifics of the case, influencing how people interpreted risk, safety, and public space in the city. As the investigation continued, pressure increased to resolve the case quickly. Political attention, media scrutiny, and public concern combined to create an environment in which certainty was demanded even when evidence remained incomplete. Within that environment, the emerging narrative around the teenagers became increasingly central. But at this stage, the case was still in its earliest phase of formation. Facts were still being gathered. Interpretations were still being tested. And beneath all of it, in a hospital room filled with steady mechanical rhythm, the woman at the center of the story remained unconscious, her life continuing in a state that had not yet returned to itself. The night had ended, but its consequences were only beginning to take shape. The first pieces of physical evidence from Central Park did not arrive in the form of clarity. They arrived in fragments, like shards of a larger reality that no longer existed in one piece. Each fragment had to be collected, catalogued, and interpreted in isolation before anyone could attempt to assemble a coherent picture of what had happened on the night of April 19, 1989. At the center of the early investigation was the space itself, Central Park. Its size was both its greatest feature and its greatest obstacle. Covering hundreds of acres, the park was not a single scene, but a collection of overlapping environments. Open fields, wooded sections, water edges, paved paths, and hidden clearings all existed within the same boundary, yet each behaved like a separate world when examined at night. Detectives moving through the park in the early morning hours after the attack encountered a landscape that no longer held the memory of the event in a stable way. Time had already begun to alter it. Foot traffic from early joggers and maintenance workers had softened potential traces. Wind had shifted leaves. The natural environment had resumed its quiet work of erasing disruption. What remained had to be extracted carefully. There were signs that indicated a struggle had occurred, but they did not present themselves in a clean narrative order. Instead, they appeared as disruptions in the environment, disturbed soil in certain areas, broken vegetation, and irregularities in the placement of objects that did not belong naturally in the landscape. Each of these signs required interpretation, and interpretation in forensic work is never neutral. It is shaped by expectation, training, and the urgency of the moment. The body of Tricia Mailey had already been removed by the time investigators fully secured the area. This created an additional layer of complexity. The absence of the central physical reference point meant that the scene had to be reconstructed indirectly. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. Observations were written down in detail. But the emotional reality of the scene, the immediacy of its violence, was already receding into documentation. In the hospital, she remained in critical condition, and her survival was still uncertain. That uncertainty added pressure to the investigation. When a victim is alive, but unable to communicate, the responsibility of explanation shifts entirely to external reconstruction. The body cannot yet speak in memory, so the environment must speak instead. Early forensic analysis focused on identifying trace evidence that could establish the presence of an unknown assailant. The process was meticulous, slow, and often frustrating. Outdoor environments are inherently unstable for evidence collection. Biological material degrades quickly. Environmental contamination is unavoidable. Even careful preservation cannot fully reverse the effects of time and exposure. Despite these challenges, investigators documented everything they could find. Each item was treated as potentially significant, even if its relevance was not immediately clear. In cases like this, certainty does not arrive at once. It accumulates gradually through comparison, elimination, and cross-referencing. As this physical investigation unfolded, a parallel process was already shaping itself in another part of the system. It was not yet formalized as a theory, but it was becoming increasingly influential in how questions were asked and who was being questioned. During the night of the incident, multiple police units had responded to unrelated disturbances involving groups of teenagers in and around Central Park. These interactions were initially routine in nature: dispersal requests, questioning, minor detentions for public disorder. None of them were connected at the time to the assault on the jogger. However, as investigators began constructing a timeline of the park's activity, these earlier interactions gained new weight. The presence of individuals who had already been in contact with law enforcement during the relevant timeframe created a point of focus. 5 teenagers were ultimately identified and taken into custody for questioning. Their presence in the park that night was not in itself evidence of wrongdoing related to the assault. But in the early stages of an investigation under intense public pressure, proximity can become a powerful organizing principle. When certainty is absent, systems tend to organize around what is most immediately visible. Inside interrogation rooms, the environment shifted completely from the open complexity of the park. These rooms were enclosed, controlled, and stripped of external reference points. Time became linear and repetitive. Questions were asked, repeated, rephrased. Answers were recorded, compared, and sometimes challenged. The teenagers were questioned separately, each in isolation from the others. This separation meant that their accounts could not naturally align or correct each other in real time. Each narrative developed independently under conditions that were not identical. Some interviews lasted longer than others. Some involved interruptions. Some extended late into the night, when fatigue inevitably altered perception and response. The statements produced in these sessions would later become central to the legal case. At the time, however, they existed as raw material rather than finalized testimony. They were not yet stabilized by legal scrutiny or cross-examination. They were recorded versions of speech under pressure, later treated as structured accounts of events. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation rooms, the city continued to process the case in its own way. News coverage intensified. Early reports emphasized the brutality of the attack and the vulnerability of the victim. The language used in media descriptions began to shape public interpretation. Central Park, once associated with leisure and openness, was increasingly framed as a site of danger and unpredictability. The emotional shift was rapid. People who had once viewed the park as a safe public space began to reconsider how and when they entered it. The victim's identity also began to circulate more widely. While initially described in limited terms, her name eventually became public, and with that transition, she ceased to exist in public discourse as a fully private individual. She became associated with the incident itself, and the incident began to define how she was perceived. This transformation is a common, but often overlooked aspect of high-profile cases. The transition from person to symbol happens gradually, but once complete, it becomes difficult to reverse. The symbolic version of a victim carries emotional weight for the public, but it often lacks the full complexity of the individual's life. Inside the hospital, however, none of this symbolic transformation mattered. Medical staff continued to focus on her physical condition, which remained critical, but stable enough to allow continued treatment. Progress, when it occurred, was slow and incremental. There were no immediate recoveries, only slight changes that suggested the possibility of future improvement. The investigation, meanwhile, continued to move forward under increasing pressure to reach conclusions. As evidence was reviewed and statements were compared, investigators attempted to construct a coherent sequence of events. The challenge was not only identifying what had happened, but also aligning multiple incomplete data sources into a single timeline. Environmental evidence, witness accounts, and custodial statements all had to be integrated into a consistent narrative. In this process, inconsistencies naturally emerged. Some details did not align perfectly across accounts. Some timelines overlapped in ways that were difficult to reconcile. In normal investigative conditions, such inconsistencies would require extended analysis. Under pressure, however, they often become secondary to the need for direction. By the end of this phase, the case had begun to take a structured form in official perception. A sequence of events was being assembled. Individuals were being associated with specific actions within that sequence. The narrative was not yet finalized in legal terms, but its shape was becoming increasingly defined. What remained unresolved was the possibility that the structure itself might not fully match the reality of what had occurred in the park that night. That question would not be answered in the early stages of the investigation. For now, the city continued to move forward with a story that was still incomplete, built from fragments collected in the dark spaces between certainty and assumption. The first full hours of the investigation into the assault in Central Park were defined not by answers, but by movement. People moving through spaces. Officers moving through terrain. Information moving through channels that were not yet synchronized into a single coherent system. It was a case in its earliest and most unstable phase, where every new piece of input had the potential to reshape everything that came before it. At the center of this shifting structure was a simple problem: the absence of a direct witness to the attack itself. Without a clear account of what had happened in the crucial moments, investigators were forced to reconstruct the event from surrounding conditions. This meant that the park became not just a location, but a kind of fragmented archive. Every pathway, every clearing, every disturbed patch of ground was treated as a possible holder of meaning. The physical evidence collected from the scene did not immediately form a narrative. Instead, it formed a collection of inconsistencies and partial signals. Signs of struggle were identified, but their exact sequence was unclear. The environment had already begun to reclaim the space, softening edges, dispersing traces, and blending disruption back into natural irregularity. This is one of the most challenging aspects of outdoor crime scenes. Nature does not preserve evidence, it absorbs it. Detectives documented everything with care, but documentation itself is not interpretation. Photographs captured what was visible, but not necessarily what was significant. Notes recorded positions and conditions, but not intention or sequence. Each item collected from the scene would later require contextual alignment with other data sources, none of which were yet fully available. At the same time, a parallel investigative track was forming based on activity reports from the same night. Earlier in the evening, police units had responded to multiple disturbances involving groups of teenagers in different sections of Central Park. These incidents were not initially linked to the assault. They were treated as separate matters of public disorder, routine in the context of a large urban park on a warm spring night. However, as investigators began assembling a timeline of presence within the park, these earlier interactions took on new significance. The logic was simple in structure, even if complex in implication. If certain individuals had been present in the same space during the relevant time frame, and if they had already been in contact with law enforcement, then their movements deserved closer examination. This is how investigative focus often narrows in real time. Not through certainty, but through accumulation of proximity. 5 teenagers were eventually identified and taken into custody for questioning. Their involvement, at this stage, was defined only by presence and prior contact with police during the same night. There was no confirmed physical evidence linking them to the assault when they were first brought in. Their significance emerged gradually through procedural escalation rather than direct forensic match. Inside the interrogation rooms, the environment changed completely from the open complexity of the park. The rooms were small, controlled, and deliberately stripped of external reference points. This design is not accidental. It removes environmental continuity, so that focus remains entirely on dialogue, memory, and response. But it also has an effect on perception, especially when sessions become prolonged. Each teenager was questioned separately. This separation ensured that their accounts developed in isolation, without the natural corrective influence of shared comparison. Over time, statements were recorded that would later become central to the legal case. At the moment of their creation, however, they were not stable narratives. They were responses shaped by the immediate conditions of questioning, influenced by fatigue, stress, and the psychological pressure inherent in custodial interrogation. The legal significance of these statements would only become fully defined later, during court proceedings and appellate review. At this stage, they existed as evolving records within an ongoing investigation, not as finalized truth. Meanwhile, the victim, Tricia Maley, remained in critical condition in hospital care. Her medical situation continued to anchor the urgency of the case. The severity of her injuries meant that recovery was uncertain, and this uncertainty intensified public and institutional pressure to identify an explanation for what had occurred. In high-profile cases involving extreme violence, unresolved status often accelerates investigative momentum, even when evidentiary foundations are still developing. Outside the hospital, her identity was beginning to circulate more widely. She was no longer described only in procedural terms. Media coverage increasingly referred to her as the Central Park Jogger, a label that condensed her identity into a single moment of activity and location. This naming convention, while effective for public communication, also reduced the complexity of her life into a simplified symbolic frame. That symbolic frame had consequences. It shaped public perception of vulnerability, urban safety, and randomness of violence. It also influenced emotional response to the case, intensifying demand for resolution. Within the investigative team, however, the focus remained on constructing a sequence of events that could explain the physical evidence and reported activity within the park. This required integrating multiple data streams, environmental observations, initial witness accounts, patrol logs, and custodial statements. The challenge was not simply gathering information, but aligning it into a consistent timeline that could withstand legal scrutiny. As this process continued, inconsistencies began to appear across different accounts. Certain details did not align perfectly. Some timelines overlapped in ways that required interpretation. Some descriptions of movement within the park were difficult to reconcile with physical geography. These discrepancies did not immediately invalidate any single account, but they introduced complexity into the emerging narrative. In a system under pressure, complexity often creates a demand for simplification. Investigations do not operate in isolation from external expectations. Media attention, political concern, and public anxiety all contribute to an environment in which resolution becomes increasingly urgent. This urgency does not directly determine outcomes, but it shapes the pace and direction of analysis. It influences which leads are prioritized, which interpretations are emphasized, and how uncertainty is managed during early reconstruction. By the end of this phase, a preliminary structure of the case had begun to form within official investigative understanding. It was not yet a concluded narrative, but it was no longer entirely open-ended. Certain individuals had become central to questioning. Certain timelines had been prioritized. Certain interpretations of movement within the park had gained prominence. What remained unresolved was whether this emerging structure fully corresponded to the actual sequence of events that had occurred in the park that night, or whether it represented only the most accessible interpretation of incomplete information. That question would remain in the background of the case for years, even as the investigation moved forward into its next and most controversial stages. The investigation into the Central Park assault had reached a stage where pressure and uncertainty began to merge into something that felt, to those inside the system, like direction. By the time the case entered its next phase, the initial chaos of evidence collection and early interviews had already been shaped into a working narrative framework. It was not a finalized theory, but it was no longer an open field of possibilities either. Certain paths had become more visible than others. Certain individuals had become central points of focus. And within that narrowing field of attention, momentum began to form. The turning point did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It emerged through accumulation, through repeated interrogation sessions, through statements that began to align in partial ways under pressure, and through the growing need to resolve a case that had already become a public symbol of urban fear in New York City. Inside the investigation, detectives were still working with incomplete physical evidence from Central Park. The park had offered fragments, but not clarity. There was no single forensic signature that immediately identified a perpetrator. Instead, there were traces, environmental disruptions, and partial biological evidence that required interpretation. In cases like this, interpretation becomes just as important as collection. An interpretation is always vulnerable to the assumptions of the people performing it. At the same time, attention had increasingly centered on 5 teenagers who had been detained following earlier incidents in the park. Their initial contact with police had not been connected to the assault itself. It had been related to disturbances reported throughout the night, unrelated acts of disorder that were treated as separate matters. But as timelines were reconstructed, their presence in the park during the relevant hours made them subjects of continued scrutiny. The shift from peripheral presence to investigative focus did not happen through a single piece of evidence. It happened through proximity, repetition, and procedural escalation. Once they were identified as individuals who had been in the park during the critical time frame, they became part of the investigative structure. From that point forward, every interaction with them carried interpretive weight. The interrogation process that followed became the center of what would later be considered one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Each teenager was questioned separately. The rooms where these interrogations took place were deliberately designed to be controlled environments. There were no windows that connected to the outside world in a meaningful way. Time was measured only by internal clocks and procedural shifts. The absence of external reference points created a psychological environment in which focus narrowed entirely onto the interaction between questioner and subject. The interrogations were lengthy. In some cases, they extended across multiple sessions. In others, they continued late into the night. The structure of questioning often repeated itself, circling back to the same events from different angles, asking for clarification, correction, or contradiction. Over time, this repetition created conditions in which responses could become less about recollection and more about adaptation. Within these sessions, statements began to emerge that investigators would later treat as admissions of involvement. These statements were recorded, transcribed, and compared across different interviews. At a surface level, certain elements appeared to align. This alignment was significant in the context of a case that had lacked a clear direct witness to the attack itself. However, the process by which these statements were obtained would later become a central subject of legal and public scrutiny. The conditions of custodial interrogation, particularly when involving minors, introduce complex psychological dynamics. Fatigue, stress, isolation, and repeated questioning can all influence how individuals respond. In this case, those dynamics would become critical in understanding how the narrative of the investigation took shape. At the time, though, these complexities were not the focus of the investigative momentum. What mattered most to those working the case was the emergence of structure within uncertainty. The statements provided a framework that appeared to connect previously fragmented elements of the investigation. And in high-pressure cases, the presence of a framework often becomes more compelling than the unresolved questions surrounding its formation. As the interrogation process continued, the case began to shift from an open investigation into a structured narrative of alleged events. The teenagers were now positioned within that narrative as central participants. Their statements were used to reconstruct a sequence of actions that aligned with the timeline being developed by investigators. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation rooms, the broader city was responding to the case in increasingly intense ways. Media coverage had expanded significantly. The story was no longer just about a single violent incident. It had become a focal point for broader concerns about safety, youth violence, and public space in urban environments. The language used in reporting grew more definitive as the narrative solidified. Early uncertainty was gradually replaced by descriptions that suggested clarity had been achieved. This shift in public narrative created feedback pressure on the investigation itself. While investigators are expected to operate independently of public opinion, they are not entirely insulated from it. High-profile cases exist within a social environment that demands resolution. And when statements appear to provide that resolution, they tend to be reinforced rather than questioned in the early stages. Within the legal system, the emerging case structure began to move toward formal charges. The teenagers were no longer simply subjects of interrogation. They were becoming defendants within a developing prosecution framework. The transition from investigation to prosecution is a critical moment in any criminal case, as it marks the point where narrative interpretation begins to solidify into legal accusation. At this stage, the evidence presented included both physical findings from the park and statements obtained during interrogation. The physical evidence, however, remained complex and open to interpretation. It did not present a single clear pathway that directly linked all accused individuals to the crime in a straightforward forensic manner. Instead, it required contextual alignment with testimonial accounts. The reliance on testimonial evidence became increasingly important as the case progressed. The statements provided structure where physical evidence remained fragmented. This reliance, however, also meant that the stability of the emerging narrative depended heavily on the conditions under which those statements were produced. Inside the legal process, these statements were treated as confessions or admissions of involvement. Once incorporated into the prosecution's case, they became central to the argument presented in court proceedings. The narrative now had both testimonial and circumstantial components that appeared, at least in structure, to support each other. But beneath that surface alignment, unresolved tensions remained. The timeline of events in Central Park was still not fully reconstructed with precision. The environmental evidence remained incomplete. The sequence of movements within the park still contained gaps that were filled through inference rather than direct observation. And the conditions under which statements were obtained would later become a focal point of legal challenge. For the public, however, these uncertainties were largely invisible at this stage. What was visible was a coherent narrative emerging from a period of chaos. 5 teenagers had been connected to a violent crime. Statements had been obtained that appeared to describe involvement. The investigation had produced a direction. That sense of direction became the breakthrough moment in public perception. It was not necessarily a breakthrough in forensic certainty, but it functioned as one within the structure of the investigation. A case that had begun in confusion now appeared to have identified those responsible. Within the city, the reaction was immediate and intense. The case became a symbol of both fear and resolution. Fear, because of the nature of the crime. Resolution, because the system appeared to have responded quickly and decisively. Yet within the deeper layers of the investigation, questions remained unresolved. The relationship between physical evidence and testimonial evidence was still being examined internally. The completeness of the reconstructed timeline had not been fully validated through independent corroboration of every element. And the psychological conditions under which statements were obtained remained a subject that would later draw significant attention. At this stage, however, those questions existed beneath the surface of a case that was rapidly moving toward legal resolution. The breakthrough, as it was understood at the time, was not a single moment of discovery. It was the moment when fragmented elements of an investigation began to form a structured narrative that could be presented in court. And once that structure was in place, the momentum of the case shifted from investigation to prosecution, carrying with it assumptions that would prove far more difficult to unravel in the years that followed. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the investigation had already transformed into something heavier than a search for truth. It had become a structure of competing narratives, each shaped by the pressure of what the city of New York City needed to believe in order to feel safe again. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was different from both the streets outside and the interrogation rooms where the statements had first been formed. It was controlled in a more formal way, but no less intense. Every movement carried procedural weight. Every silence carried interpretation. Every document placed into evidence became part of a larger effort to stabilize a story that had begun in the dark paths of Central Park, and now had to be explained under the brightness of legal scrutiny. The 5 teenagers who had been charged in connection with the attack were now defendants. Their names, Raymond Santana, Kevin Richardson, Antron McCrae, Yusef Salam, and Corey Wise, were no longer spoken as individuals in public discourse. They were grouped together as a unit of suspicion, as if their identities had merged into a single legal concept. In the courtroom, however, they sat separately, each carrying their own interpretation of what had happened to them since the night they were taken into custody. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of custodial statements, witness accounts, and reconstructed timelines. At its center was the narrative that had emerged during the investigative phase, that these 5 individuals had been present in the park during the time of the assault, that they had participated in the events leading up to it, and that their statements during interrogation reflected involvement in the crime. The defense, however, challenged every layer of that structure. They questioned the conditions under which statements were obtained, the consistency of those statements across different interrogations, and the absence of physical evidence directly linking the defendants to the most critical elements of the assault. The courtroom became a space where two interpretations of the same fragmented reality were placed against each other, each attempting to establish dominance over the same incomplete facts. One of the central tensions in the trial was the relationship between physical evidence and testimonial evidence. The physical evidence collected from the park, while significant in demonstrating that a violent crime had occurred, did not provide a direct and unambiguous link to all of the accused. Instead, it required interpretation through the lens of the statements that had been obtained during interrogation. Those statements, in turn, were presented by the prosecution as confessions or admissions that completed the narrative structure of the case. But the defense argued that those statements could not be understood without considering the environment in which they were produced. The interrogation sessions had been long, repetitive, and conducted under conditions of isolation. The defendants were minors, each experiencing the process differently, each responding under pressure that was difficult to fully capture in written transcripts. What appeared in the record as structured admissions was, according to the defense, the product of psychological exhaustion and procedural coercion rather than voluntary recollection. As testimony unfolded in court, these tensions became visible in the way witnesses described events and in the way attorneys constructed their arguments. The courtroom did not resolve contradictions easily. Instead, it amplified them. Every detail was examined, re-examined, and placed under competing interpretations. The prosecution presented a sequence of events that aligned with the investigative timeline. According to their reconstruction, the defendants had encountered the victim during the night, had moved through different areas of Central Park, and had participated in actions that culminated in the assault. The narrative was presented as coherent, structured, and supported by the statements obtained during interrogation. The defense challenged this coherence by focusing on gaps in the physical evidence and inconsistencies in the statements. They emphasized that no single piece of forensic evidence conclusively tied all defendants to the act itself. They questioned how statements obtained separately, under different conditions, could later be treated as mutually reinforcing confessions. They also raised concerns about the reliability of memory under prolonged custodial questioning. Inside the courtroom, the emotional weight of the case was undeniable. The victim, Tricia Maley, remained absent from direct testimony due to the severity of her condition and recovery process, but her presence was central to every aspect of the proceedings. The violence she had endured shaped the tone of the trial, even when she was not physically present in the room. Her identity had already become widely known, and the public narrative surrounding her condition influenced how the case was perceived outside the courthouse walls. This external pressure inevitably filtered into the courtroom environment. Although judges and attorneys are expected to operate within strict procedural boundaries, they are not insulated from the broader context in which a trial takes place. The case had already become a symbol of urban vulnerability and public concern. That symbolic weight added intensity to every argument, every objection, and every closing statement. As the trial progressed, the jury was presented with a structured narrative from the prosecution and a fragmented, but persistent counter-narrative from the defense. Each side relied on different interpretations of the same core materials. The statements obtained during interrogation were central to the prosecution's case, while the conditions under which those statements were obtained became central to the defense's challenge. Expert testimony was introduced to explain aspects of forensic evidence and interrogation psychology. These explanations added layers of complexity, but they did not eliminate the fundamental tension at the heart of the case. Instead, they highlighted how different forms of knowledge can coexist without fully resolving into a single conclusion. At times, the courtroom felt less like a space for discovering truth and more like a space for organizing uncertainty into legally recognizable form. Evidence was not only evaluated for what it showed, but also for how it fit into the broader narrative structure being constructed by each side. The jury, positioned at the center of this structure, was tasked with making a determination based on the standards of reasonable doubt and legal sufficiency. But reasonable doubt itself is not a purely mathematical concept. It is shaped by perception, by the credibility of testimony, and by the coherence of the narrative presented. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and closing arguments, the jury ultimately reached a verdict. Each of the 5 defendants was found guilty of charges related to the assault. The courtroom reaction was immediate but contained. There were no dramatic interruptions, but the emotional impact was visible in the faces of those present. The defendants, still teenagers, were now formally defined by the legal system as responsible for one of the most widely publicized violent crimes in the city's recent history. Sentencing followed the convictions. The penalties ranged from 5 to 15 years of incarceration, depending on the specific charges assigned to each individual. The sentences marked the transition from accusation to punishment, from contested narrative to formal legal conclusion. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was intense. For many members of the public, the verdict represented closure. The case that had dominated news cycles and reshaped perceptions of safety in Central Park appeared to have reached resolution. The system had identified those responsible and delivered judgment. But within legal and investigative circles, the case did not fully settle into certainty. The reliance on custodial statements, the absence of definitive forensic linkage across all elements, and the conditions under which interrogations had taken place remained points of discussion even after the verdict. Inside correctional facilities, the 5 young defendants began serving their sentences, their lives now defined by a legal outcome that would remain in place for years. Their identities, once individual and distinct, were now permanently associated with the case in public understanding. Yet beneath the surface of legal finality, unresolved questions persisted. The relationship between evidence and interpretation, between narrative structure and factual certainty, remained complex. The courtroom had produced a verdict, but it had not eliminated ambiguity. And in the background of this legal conclusion, the city continued to carry the weight of the story it believed it had resolved, unaware that the final chapter of the case had not yet been written. After the verdicts were delivered and the sentences pronounced, the courtroom did not feel like a place of resolution. It felt like a place where something had been sealed rather than truly understood. In New York City, the news spread quickly, not as a question anymore, but as a statement. 5 teenagers had been convicted for the assault in Central Park, and the city, exhausted by months of fear and speculation, began to settle into the psychological relief that comes when uncertainty is replaced by certainty, even if that certainty is incomplete. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured fragments of emotion that would later be replayed countless times. Inside families, there was no simplicity. For the families of the convicted teenagers, the verdicts did not feel like justice revealed, but like a collapse of possibility. Each of the 5 young men was no longer simply a defendant. They had become fixed points in a narrative that now extended beyond their control. The transition from courtroom to correctional facility marked a different kind of beginning. In prison, time does not move in the same way it does in public life. It becomes segmented, repetitive, and stripped of the external markers that normally define change. Days are counted, but they do not feel distinct. For the young men who entered the system after sentencing, adolescence ended not through natural progression, but through legal definition. Inside those early years of incarceration, the reality of their situation began to settle in layers. At first, there was shock, a psychological resistance to the idea that their lives had been permanently redirected. Then came adaptation, not acceptance, but adjustment, as routines replaced uncertainty. And beneath both of these states, there was a persistent awareness that their identities outside prison had already been reshaped by public narrative. The phrase that had circulated through media coverage, Central Park 5, had already taken on a life beyond the individuals it referred to. It had become shorthand, a label that condensed complexity into a single conceptual unit. In public discourse, they were no longer 5 separate teenagers with distinct backgrounds, personalities, and circumstances. They were a collective symbol attached to a single event. This symbolic transformation had consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. It influenced how the public remembered the case, how it was discussed in media retrospectives, and how it was understood in broader conversations about crime and urban safety. The narrative had achieved structural stability. It had a beginning, a middle, and an ending that appeared, at the time, to be complete. Yet inside legal and investigative communities, the case did not fully disappear into closure. There were elements that remained difficult to reconcile, even after conviction. The reliance on custodial statements, the lack of a single overwhelming forensic link tying all defendants directly to the most critical aspects of the assault, and the complexity of the interrogation conditions were all discussed in varying degrees of professional reflection. But in the absence of a formal challenge, these discussions remained secondary to the official outcome. For the victim, Tricia Maley, the aftermath was a different kind of silence. Her recovery continued slowly, marked by long periods of rehabilitation and gradual return to awareness. The injuries she sustained meant that her life would never simply return to its previous state. Instead, it moved into a new configuration, shaped by medical reality and personal adaptation. Her identity in public discourse remained tied to the case, but her private experience was one of recovery that extended far beyond the timeline of public attention. As the years passed, the case began to settle into a fixed position within the city's collective memory. It was referenced in discussions about crime policy, policing strategies, and the vulnerability of public spaces. It became part of a broader narrative about the late 1980s in New York, a period often described through the lens of urban tension and transformation. But memory is not static. Even when a case appears resolved, new interpretations can emerge when conditions change. In the years following the convictions, small cracks began to appear in the certainty that had defined the original outcome. These cracks did not immediately reshape the public narrative, but they existed in parallel, often unnoticed by those outside legal or journalistic circles. Some of these questions centered on the interrogation process itself. The conditions under which statements had been obtained continued to be a subject of discussion among legal analysts and scholars. The psychological dynamics of prolonged custodial questioning, particularly involving minors, remained a complex area of study. These discussions did not directly challenge the verdict in public forums at first, but they contributed to a growing undercurrent of reevaluation. Within the correctional environment, the 5 men lived through these years in separation from the world that continued to reference their case. Their lives were defined by institutional structure, but their identities remained tethered to a public narrative that did not evolve at the same pace as their personal experience. Over time, this disconnect became part of their reality. They were living inside one version of history, while the outside world continued to reinforce another. In the broader cultural landscape, the case began to appear in documentaries, academic discussions, and retrospective analyses. Each new reference added layers to how it was understood, not by changing the official outcome, but by expanding the range of interpretations surrounding it. The case was no longer just about a single night in Central Park. It had become a reference point for conversations about justice, procedure, and the reliability of narrative construction under pressure. Yet during this period, the core legal status of the case remained unchanged. The convictions stood. The sentences were being served. The system that had produced the outcome continued to operate on the assumption that the process had reached its correct conclusion. What makes the aftermath of such cases complex is not only what is known, but what remains unresolved beneath the surface of what is officially recorded. The courtroom had produced a definitive answer in legal terms, but legal answers do not always align neatly with the evolving nature of understanding. Within families, time moved differently. For the families of the convicted, each year of incarceration represented not just the passage of time, but the continuation of a question that had not been resolved in their own sense of reality. For the victim's family, the case remained a central point in their understanding of what had happened and how it had affected their lives. These parallel experiences existed within the same historical event, but did not converge into a single emotional interpretation. The city itself also continued to change. Neighborhoods evolved. Policing strategies shifted. Public discourse moved on to new cases, new concerns, new narratives. But certain cases do not disappear entirely from collective memory. They remain as reference points that can be reactivated when similar discussions arise. The Central Park case became one of those reference points. It was invoked in debates about interrogation practices, juvenile justice, and media influence on public perception. Over time, it also became a case study in how narratives can solidify under pressure, and how difficult it can be to revisit them once they have become structurally embedded in public understanding. In the background of all these developments, the question of truth remained layered and complex. Not because nothing had happened, but because what had happened was interpreted through systems that were themselves under pressure at the time. Investigation, media, public expectation, and legal process all interacted to produce an outcome that carried both certainty and ambiguity, even if only one of those qualities was visible at the time of conviction. The aftermath of the case, therefore, is not a single moment, but a long stretch of time in which different versions of the same event continued to exist side by side. The official version remains fixed in legal history. The personal versions continue to evolve within those who lived through it. And the cultural version continues to shift as new generations encounter the case through different lenses. In that space between versions, the case does not end. It continues to exist, not as a closed chapter, but as a structure that invites ongoing reconsideration, even when no new events are actively unfolding within it. For more than a decade after the convictions, the case of the 5 teenagers from New York City existed in a strange suspended state. In official records, it was closed. In public understanding, it was largely settled. In media memory, it had become a reference point for a particular kind of urban fear. Yet beneath all of these layers of apparent closure, the case never fully stopped moving. It simply moved more slowly, beneath the surface of attention, where older files, forgotten questions, and unexamined inconsistencies tend to accumulate over time. Inside correctional facilities, the individuals convicted in connection with the attack in Central Park lived through those years in a rhythm defined by routine and distance. Their lives were measured in restricted movement, regulated communication, and limited access to the outside world. But time in confinement does not erase public identity. It intensifies it. Each of them remained, in the eyes of the public narrative, permanently attached to the event that had defined their sentencing. Meanwhile, the victim's recovery continued along its own path, far removed from the legal and cultural structures that had formed around the case. Her life had been fundamentally altered, but it was no longer defined only by the moment of violence. It was also defined by rehabilitation, adaptation, and the slow process of rebuilding function and memory under medical guidance. Yet even as her private reality evolved, her public identity remained anchored to a name the media had fixed early in the case, a label that continued to circulate whenever the story was revisited. For years, the official version of events remained unchanged. The convictions stood. The legal system treated the matter as resolved. And the city moved forward, as cities do, carrying the case as part of its historical landscape rather than its active present. But cases like this rarely remain completely dormant. In 2002, more than a decade after the original trial, a new development emerged that would destabilize the foundation of the long-established narrative. It did not begin in a courtroom or a media report. It began inside a prison, in the life of a man named Matias Reyes. Reyes was not part of the original case. He was serving a sentence for multiple violent crimes, including sexual assault and murder, unrelated to the Central Park case. His background was already well known within the correctional system. He had a history of serious offenses, a pattern of violence that had placed him under long-term incarceration. For years, he had lived within the prison structure like many others, without any apparent connection to the case that had defined a different set of lives outside. Then, unexpectedly, he came forward with a confession. Reyes stated that he alone had committed the assault on the woman in Central Park in 1989. According to his account, he had been responsible for the attack from beginning to end, acting independently and without any involvement from the 5 individuals who had been convicted. This claim immediately introduced a possibility that had not been part of the public understanding for years, that the original investigative narrative might not have correctly identified the perpetrator. Confessions in isolation do not automatically redefine established cases. Investigators treat them with caution, particularly when they arise years after a conviction. People confess for many reasons, and those reasons are not always connected to factual responsibility. Because of this, Reyes's statement was not accepted at face value. It triggered a formal review process, rather than an immediate reversal of the existing convictions. What made this situation different, however, was not the confession alone. It was what followed it. Investigators reopened the forensic record from the original case. Evidence that had been collected in 1989 was re-examined using modern DNA analysis techniques that were not available at the time of the original trial. This technological advancement was critical because it allowed for a level of biological comparison that earlier methods could not achieve with the same precision. When the DNA results from the crime scene were compared against Reyes's genetic profile, a direct match was identified. The biological evidence recovered from the assault site aligned with his DNA in a way that placed him at the center of the physical crime scene. At the same time, there was no corresponding DNA evidence linking the 5 individuals previously convicted to the biological material recovered from the scene. This created a profound shift in the evidentiary landscape of the case. For the first time since 1989, there was forensic confirmation that pointed clearly toward a single individual whose presence at the scene was supported by physical evidence. And equally significant, there was a lack of forensic support for the involvement of the previously convicted individuals. The implications of this were not immediately translated into legal action. The justice system does not reverse itself instantaneously, even in the presence of new evidence. Instead, it enters a procedural phase of review, verification, and legal reconsideration. Each prior conviction had to be examined in light of the new findings. Each piece of evidence had to be recontextualized within the updated understanding of events. As this process unfolded, attention returned to the original structure of the investigation. The interrogation statements that had played a central role in the convictions were re-examined. Questions resurfaced about how those statements had been obtained, the conditions under which they were recorded, and the extent to which they could be considered reliable indicators of actual involvement in the crime. The tension between testimonial evidence and physical evidence, which had always existed beneath the surface of the case, now became central to its re-evaluation. The DNA evidence provided a level of objectivity that contrasted sharply with the subjective nature of custodial statements produced under pressure in 1989. This contrast did not automatically invalidate every element of the original investigation, but it significantly altered how those elements were interpreted. As the review progressed, legal authorities began moving toward formal reconsideration of the convictions. The process was not immediate, but it was decisive in its direction. The foundation of the original case, which had once appeared stable, was now understood to be incompatible with the new forensic findings. Eventually, the convictions were vacated. The legal system officially set aside the previous judgments, acknowledging that the original verdicts could not stand in light of the newly established DNA evidence and the confession from Reyes. This did not erase the history of the case, but it fundamentally altered its legal status. What had once been treated as a resolved matter was now recognized as a wrongful conviction. In New York City, the announcement carried significant emotional and institutional weight. It forced a reassessment not only of the specific case, but of the broader processes that had led to its original outcome. Questions that had lingered quietly for years now became central to public and legal discourse. How had the original investigation narrowed its focus so quickly? How had custodial statements come to outweigh the absence of physical evidence? How had a narrative achieved such stability in the absence of definitive forensic confirmation? For the individuals who had been convicted, the vacating of the verdicts marked the beginning of a new phase of life. It did not immediately undo the years already spent in incarceration, nor did it fully resolve the personal and psychological consequences of that time. But it restored legal status, and with it, the recognition that the original convictions were not supported by the full evidentiary record as it was now understood. In the broader public sphere, the case became something different from what it had been before. It was no longer simply a story of crime and conviction. It had become a case study in the limits of investigative certainty under pressure, the fallibility of custodial interrogation, and the importance of forensic advancement in revisiting past conclusions. The discovery of Reyes's involvement also reframed the original timeline of events in Central Park. What had once been interpreted as a coordinated series of actions involving multiple individuals was now understood through a different lens, one that placed a single perpetrator at the center of the physical evidence. This recontextualization did not erase the complexity of the original investigation, but it shifted its meaning significantly. Over time, the case became part of a broader discussion about systemic failure and institutional pressure. It was referenced in legal education, journalistic analysis, and public policy debates. It stood as an example of how investigative momentum, once formed, can become difficult to reverse even when new evidence emerges later. Yet even with the legal reversal, the emotional and social dimensions of the case remained layered and unresolved. For those directly involved, including the victim and the individuals who had been convicted, the passage of time had already created experiences that could not be fully rewritten by legal correction. The case, in its final form, did not end with a simple conclusion. It ended with recognition that what had once been considered certain was, in fact, incomplete. And that recognition became its most lasting legacy. The years after the convictions, and before the official reversal, created a strange kind of silence around the case of the 5 teenagers from New York City. It was not a silence of disappearance, but a silence of acceptance. The public had already formed a stable narrative. The legal system had already issued its conclusion. And the city had already moved forward, carrying the case as part of its history rather than its present. In the correctional system, the individuals convicted in connection with the attack in Central Park lived through those years in a reality that was structured but constantly constrained. Each day followed institutional rhythm, but internally, time behaved differently. For some, it felt repetitive and static. For others, it felt stretched and fragmented. But for all of them, life was no longer something that unfolded freely. It was something that was administered. Outside those walls, however, the narrative was stable. The case was referenced as resolved. It was used in discussions about urban safety, policing strategies, and juvenile crime. It became part of a broader cultural memory of late 1980s New York, a period often described through themes of tension, fear, and institutional pressure. For the victim, recovery had already become a separate timeline entirely. Her life no longer existed within the structure of the case as it was publicly understood. Instead, it existed in rehabilitation, medical follow-up, and gradual reintegration into personal identity beyond trauma. Yet even as she moved forward privately, the public association with the case remained fixed. This duality, between lived experience and public narrative, is one of the most persistent features of high-profile criminal cases. Once a story becomes widely known, it develops its own internal logic, independent of later developments in personal lives or legal interpretation. It becomes part of collective memory rather than individual reality. For years, that memory remained largely unchanged. Then, in 2002, the case re-entered public attention in a way that disrupted its apparent closure. The catalyst was the emergence of Matias Reyes, a man already incarcerated for a series of violent crimes unrelated to the Central Park case. His criminal history was serious and well documented, and he was serving a life sentence for multiple offenses. Within the prison system, he was not connected in any known way to the events of 1989. His confession that he alone had committed the assault in Central Park did not initially overturn anything. Confessions from incarcerated individuals require verification, particularly when they contradict established convictions that have stood for over a decade. But Reyes's statement contained specific details that prompted investigators to take it seriously enough to reopen forensic review. What followed was a process that moved cautiously but steadily. The original physical evidence from the case was re-examined using DNA testing methods that had become far more advanced since 1989. At the time of the original trial, DNA analysis was not as precise or as widely used in courtroom proceedings as it would later become. By 2002, however, it had become a central tool in forensic investigation. When the biological evidence from the crime scene was tested against Reyes's DNA profile, the results indicated a direct match. This was a turning point that shifted the case from theoretical reconsideration to evidentiary contradiction. The presence of his genetic material at the scene provided physical confirmation that aligned with his confession. At the same time, the same DNA evidence did not link any of the 5 previously convicted individuals to the biological material recovered from the crime scene. This absence was equally significant. It did not simply introduce doubt. It removed a key form of physical corroboration that would normally be expected in a case of this nature. As investigators reviewed these findings, the structure of the original case began to appear different in hindsight. The narrative that had been constructed during the initial investigation had relied heavily on custodial statements and interpreted sequences of events. Physical evidence had supported the occurrence of a crime, but it had not definitively established the involvement of the individuals who had been convicted. The new forensic results created a fundamental tension between the original narrative and the updated scientific findings. This tension could not be resolved through reinterpretation alone. It required formal legal reconsideration. As a result, the convictions were eventually vacated. This legal action did not simply modify the outcome, it fundamentally altered the status of the case. What had once been considered a completed judicial process was now recognized as having produced an incorrect result based on the evidence available at the time and the methods used to interpret it. In the aftermath of this reversal, public understanding of the case underwent a significant shift. The same events were now viewed through a different lens, one shaped by the presence of DNA evidence and the re-evaluation of interrogation practices. The case became a reference point not only for crime in Central Park, but also for broader discussions about the reliability of confessions obtained under pressure and the limitations of investigative procedures in high-stress environments. Within legal and academic circles, the case began to be analyzed in terms of systemic structure. It raised questions about how investigative focus can narrow under pressure, how narrative coherence can sometimes be mistaken for factual certainty, and how emerging technologies can reshape understanding of past conclusions. The park itself remained unchanged physically, but its symbolic meaning continued to evolve. Central Park had once been associated with fear in the immediate aftermath of the crime. Later, it had been associated with conviction and closure. After the reversal, it became associated with uncertainty and reconsideration. For the individuals who had been convicted, the legal reversal marked a formal correction of their status, but it did not erase the years already lived under the original judgment. Their experiences during incarceration remained part of their personal histories, even as the legal system acknowledged that those convictions were no longer valid. For the victim, the case continued to exist in public memory in ways that were not always aligned with her private reality. Her recovery and life beyond the incident were often overshadowed in public discourse by the legal and investigative dimensions of the case itself. In the broader context of New York City, the case became part of a larger conversation about institutional accountability and the evolution of forensic science. It was cited in discussions about how justice systems adapt over time and how past decisions are reinterpreted in light of new evidence. Even after legal resolution, the case did not fully settle into simplicity. Instead, it remained layered. It contained multiple truths that existed at different points in time: the truth of the original investigation, the truth of the convictions, as they were understood in 1990, and the truth revealed by DNA evidence in 2002. These layers did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, forming a complex structure of interpretation that continues to be examined in legal, academic, and cultural contexts. And in that structure, the case remains not as a single story with a single ending, but as a reminder that even systems designed to determine truth can arrive at conclusions that later require revision when new forms of evidence emerge.